And that's what made what happened next so shocking. Because behind that polished image, cracks were already showing. Think about it this way. When you give someone that much authority, control over investigations that can make or break presidents, senators, entire careers, you're placing enormous trust in their judgment. You're betting they'll use that power wisely, fairly, without letting personal feelings creep in. But what if they don't? What if they start to believe they're the only one who can save the country? That's a dangerous mindset, and that's exactly where Comey's story starts to unravel. The first big test came during the 2016 presidential election. You probably remember it, Hillary Clinton's private email server. It was everywhere in the news. Clinton had used a personal server to handle government emails while she was Secretary of State, including some that contained classified information. The FBI investigated. And when the investigation wrapped up, Comey did something almost unheard of for an FBI director. He held a press conference. Now, normally, the FBI doesn't do that. Their job is to gather evidence and pass it to prosecutors at the Department of Justice, who then decide whether to bring charges. The FBI isn't supposed to make public pronouncements about guilt or innocence. That's not their role. But Comey went ahead anyway. He stood in front of cameras and criticized Clinton for being extremely careless with classified information. Then, in the same breath, he said he wouldn't recommend charges. Let that sink in for a moment. He essentially said she broke the rules but not badly enough to prosecute. Can you imagine how confusing that must have been? Supporters of Clinton felt vindicated. Critics felt cheated. And everyone else? They just felt more distrustful of the system. That moment set the stage for what would become his defining and most controversial role, because Comey wasn't done inserting himself into politics. Not even close. Fast forward a few months, Donald Trump wins the presidency in one of the biggest upsets in American history. The country is divided, emotions are running high, and behind the scenes, something even more unusual is happening. Comey, still FBI director, begins meeting privately with President-elect Trump. These aren't formal briefings with staff present. These are one-on-one conversations, and according to Comey himself, he's already suspicious of Trump. During these meetings, Comey reassures Trump that he's not personally under investigation. Sounds straightforward, right? But here's where it gets strange. After each conversation, Comey goes back to his office and writes detailed memos about what was said. He doesn't file these memos in official FBI records. Instead, he keeps them in his personal safe. Why would he do that? According to Comey, it was for his own protection insurance, in case Trump ever turned on him. But think about what that means. The head of the FBI, who's supposed to be neutral, is already treating the president like a potential adversary. He's documenting conversations, hiding them away, preparing for a fight. That's not the behavior of someone trying to serve the country impartially. That's the behavior of someone playing chess while everyone else thinks they're just having a conversation. And those memos? They didn't stay hidden for long. But keeping secret notes wasn't the problem. It was what he did with them. Here's where the story takes a turn that still leaves a lot of people shaking their heads. In the spring of 2017, Trump fires Comey. The official reason was how he'd handled the Clinton email investigation, but Trump made it clear he was frustrated by the ongoing Russia investigation. Comey, now out of a job and out of the spotlight, does something extraordinary. He takes one of those secret memos, the ones he'd been stashing in his safe, and he gives it to a friend. Not just any friend, a law professor at Columbia University, someone with connections, someone who could get the memo into the hands of a reporter at the New York Times. And that's exactly what happened. The memo leaks, it becomes a major story, and suddenly the pressure on the Justice Department to appoint a special counsel to investigate Russian interference and possible collusion with the Trump campaign becomes overwhelming. Within days, Robert Mueller is named special counsel. Now, on the surface you might think, well, if Comey had information the public needed to know, shouldn't he have shared it? That's a fair question. But here's the thing. Comey wasn't a private citizen. He was a former FBI director who'd created those memos using government time, government resources as part of his official duties. And instead of following proper channels, he deliberately leaked them through a back door to trigger a specific outcome. He wanted Mueller appointed. He wanted Trump investigated, and he used his insider knowledge to make it happen. That's not whistleblowing, that's manipulation. And it worked. Robert Mueller was appointed. But that wasn't the only bombshell. Let's talk about Christopher Steele. If you followed the news during those years, you probably heard his name. Steele was a former British intelligence officer who compiled what became known as the Steele dossier, a collection of unverified allegations about Trump's supposed ties to Russia. It was explosive, salacious, and it spread like wildfire through Washington and the media. But here's what a lot of people didn't know at the time. Steele wasn't working for the U.S. government. He was working for a private research firm called Fusion GPS, which had been hired by a law firm, which in turn was being paid by Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic National Committee. In other words, this dossier, which would fuel years of investigations and breathless news coverage, was opposition research funded by Trump's political opponents. Now, opposition research isn't illegal. Campaigns dig up dirt on each other all the time. But what Comey did with that dossier crossed a line. Instead of treating it with extreme skepticism, as you'd expect from the head of the FBI, Comey's bureau used it as part of the basis for investigating Trump's campaign. They presented it to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISA for short, to justify monitoring Carter Page, a former Trump campaign advisor. Here's the problem. The FBI never told the FISA judges where the dossier came from. They didn't say, hey, by the way, this was paid for by Trump's political opponent, and a lot of it is unverified gossip. They just presented it as if it were credible intelligence. And that's not just sloppy, it's potentially illegal. When you go before a judge to get a surveillance warrant, you have a duty to be honest about your sources and to present any evidence that might contradict your case. Comey's FBI didn't do that. Later, a Department of Justice Inspector General report found significant problems with how the FISA applications were handled. Mistakes, omissions, misleading statements, and at the center of it all was this dossier that never should have been treated as reliable in the first place. This dossier wasn't just gossip, it was used to justify surveillance. And that should alarm anyone who cares about civil liberties, regardless of how you feel about Trump. Senator Lindsey Graham, who chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee, put it bluntly. He said that withholding exculpatory information from a court isn't just a mistake, it's obstruction of justice. When you deliberately mislead judges to get a warrant, you're not protecting democracy, you're undermining it. For many, this wasn't just sloppy work, it looked like a conspiracy. Now, let's talk about Michael Flynn. If you're not familiar with his story, Flynn was a retired general who'd served as Trump's national security advisor for less than a month before resigning. He'd had conversations with the Russian ambassador during the transition, which isn't unusual, but he misled Vice President Pence and others about those conversations. That led to an FBI interview, which ultimately led to Flynn pleading guilty to lying to federal agents. But how that interview came about is where Comey's role gets troubling again. Comey himself admitted, he even joked about it, that he took advantage of the chaos in the early days of the Trump administration. He said something like, I sent a couple of guys over to the White House, and they got in. Normally, you'd coordinate through the White House counsel's office. You'd make sure the subject of the interview had a lawyer present. But Comey bypassed all of that. He sent agents to interview Flynn, knowing the administration was disorganized, knowing Flynn probably wouldn't have legal representation. Flynn talked to them. He denied some things that the FBI already had transcripts of, and that became the basis for charges against him. Now, did Flynn make a mistake by not being truthful? Absolutely. But should the FBI director have set him up like that? That's a much harder question. To critics, this wasn't law enforcement, it was entrapment. Even the FBI agents who conducted the interview reportedly felt Flynn had been honest with them and hadn't intended to mislead. But that didn't stop the case from moving forward. And it didn't stop Flynn's life from being turned upside down. He lost his job, his savings, his reputation, all from an interview that never should have happened the way it did. So where does all of this leave us with Comey? Well, eventually, the wheels of justice started turning. Years after he left the FBI, Comey was indicted on 2 charges: lying to Congress and obstruction of justice. The first charge related to whether he'd authorized leaks to the media. Comey had testified under oath that he hadn't, but evidence suggested otherwise, particularly involving his deputy, Andrew McCabe, who himself was found to have lied multiple times, including under oath, according to the Justice Department's Inspector General. The second charge was obstruction, specifically, that by lying to Congress, Comey had obstructed their investigation into what had happened during the 2016 election and its aftermath. Now, these are serious charges. If proven, they carry real consequences. But here's the thing, even if Comey is never convicted, even if he manages to avoid prison, the courtroom wasn't the only place Comey was on trial. He was facing a moral one, too. That's where people like Pam Bondi, the current Attorney General, and others like Devin Nunes, former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and Senator Lindsey Graham come in. They've all argued that the charges against Comey, while significant, might not be enough. They believe there's a case for a broader conspiracy charge, that Comey, along with others in the intelligence community, orchestrated a campaign to undermine a sitting president using the power of the federal government. Nunes has talked about how Comey and others made up things using intelligence that did not exist and misled the American people. Graham has said that obstruction in this case goes beyond just leaking it, includes withholding exculpatory evidence from the FISA court, lying about the dossier, and refusing to investigate leads that could have exonerated Trump. Whether charges stick or not, the damage to trust was undeniable. And that brings us to perhaps the most important perspective in this whole saga, the moral and ethical dimension. Victor Davis Hanson, a historian and commentator, put it in terms that really cut to the heart of the matter. He said that even if Comey escapes harsh legal punishment, even if he's never convicted in a courtroom, he is morally and ethically bankrupt. Think about what that means. Comey weaponized the FBI. He used the immense power of that institution, an institution that's supposed to be above politics, that's supposed to protect all Americans equally, to go after a president he didn't like. He misled the public, he misled Congress, he misled judges, and in doing so he tore apart the faith that ordinary Americans have in their government. You know, there's a reason our founders designed the system the way they did. They understood that power corrupts. They understood that even well-intentioned people, when given too much authority, can start to believe the rules don't apply to them. That's why we have checks and balances. That's why we have oversight. But what happens when the people in charge of oversight become the ones breaking the rules? That's the question Comey's story forces us to confront. And it's not a comfortable question, but it's one we have to ask. Because here's what really happened. Comey didn't just make a few bad judgment calls. He didn't just get caught up in the heat of the moment. What he did was systematic. It was calculated. He took intelligence that was flimsy at best, treated it as gospel, and used it to launch investigations that consumed years of the country's attention and divided Americans even further than they already were. And for what? To prove he was right? To settle a score? To protect his legacy? You see, the tragedy of James Comey isn't just that he broke rules or bent procedures. The tragedy is that he genuinely seemed to believe he was doing the right thing. In his mind, he was the hero, the one person standing between American democracy and chaos. But that kind of thinking is dangerous. When you start to believe that you alone can save the country, that the normal rules don't apply to you because your cause is just, you've already lost your way. And the damage doesn't just affect one person or one administration, it affects all of us. It affects whether we can trust that when the FBI knocks on our door, they're there to uphold the law, not to pursue a political agenda. It affects whether we believe that intelligence agencies are protecting us or spying on us. It affects whether we think justice is blind or whether we think it depends on who you voted for. That's the real cost of what Comey did. And that's why, even if he never spends a day in jail, what he did matters deeply. Now, some people have tried to defend Comey. They say he was caught in an impossible situation, that Trump was unpredictable, that the Russia investigation was legitimate, that Comey was just trying to do his job in extraordinary circumstances. And look, I get it. Being FBI director during a presidential election and transition is never easy. There are no perfect choices. But here's the thing, when you're in that position, you don't get to take shortcuts. You don't get to hide evidence from judges. You don't get to leak memos through back channels to force outcomes you want. You don't get to use unverified opposition research as the basis for surveillance. Because once you start doing those things, you're not the hero anymore, you're part of the problem. And the worst part? Comey still doesn't seem to get it. In interviews and in his book, he's defended his actions. He's portrayed himself as a tragic figure who is just trying to protect American institutions. But protecting institutions doesn't mean putting yourself above them. It means following the rules even when it's hard, even when you're convinced you know better. So the question remains, what does all of this mean for America? What does it mean for you? Here's where we need to zoom out and see the bigger picture. The Comey situation isn't really about one man. It's not even just about Trump or Clinton or any individual politician. It's about something much more fundamental: accountability. It's about whether the people who wield enormous power in our government can be held responsible when they abuse that power. Think about it this way. Most of us go through life playing by the rules. We pay our taxes. We follow the laws. We do our best to be honest and fair in our dealings with others. And when we mess up, there are consequences. If you break the law, you face charges. If you lie under oath, you go to jail. If you betray someone's trust, you lose relationships. But what about the people at the top? What happens when they break the rules? That's the question that keeps a lot of Americans up at night. And Comey's story doesn't give us a very reassuring answer. Because even though he's been indicted, even though his actions have been exposed and criticized, there's still a real possibility he'll never face serious consequences. He might get a slap on the wrist. He might settle. He might even walk away completely if a jury decides the evidence doesn't meet the legal standard. And if that happens, what message does it send? It sends the message that if you're powerful enough, if you're connected enough, if you can afford the right lawyers and have the right friends in the media, the rules don't really apply to you. That's not the America most of us want to live in. That's not the America our parents and grandparents fought for. But here's the thing. It doesn't have to be that way. And that's where you come in. You might be thinking, what can I do? I'm just one person. I don't have power or influence. But that's not true. You have more power than you realize. Because the only way these institutions get fixed is if ordinary Americans, people like you, demand accountability. What does that look like in practice? It means paying attention. It means not just accepting what you hear on the news or what some politician tells you, but digging a little deeper. It means asking questions. It means holding your elected representatives accountable. It also means not falling into the trap of thinking this is just about one political party. Because while Comey's actions were aimed at Trump, the underlying problem, unelected officials wielding unchecked power, affects everyone. Today it's Trump. Tomorrow it could be someone you support. The principle is the same. No one should be above the law, and no one should be able to weaponize government institutions for political ends. And it means supporting transparency. One of the most frustrating things about the Comey situation is how much happened behind closed doors. Secret memos, secret FISA warrants, secret investigations. The American people deserve to know what their government is doing in their name. Sunshine, as they say, is the best disinfectant. When we shine light on these dark corners, it becomes much harder for people to get away with abuse. Now, I know some of you might be feeling discouraged. You might be thinking, the system is so broken, what's the point? And I understand that. It's exhausting to watch powerful people seemingly get away with things that would land ordinary folks in serious trouble. But here's why I remain optimistic. Despite everything, despite the lies, the leaks, the manipulation, the truth did come out. It took years. It took dedicated journalists and whistleblowers and congressional investigators who wouldn't let it go. But eventually, we learned what Comey did. We learned about the memos. We learned about the dossier. We learned about the FISA abuses. The truth surfaced. And once the truth is out there, it's very hard to put it back in the box. People know now. They know that the FBI isn't always the good guys. They know that intelligence agencies can be politicized. They know that even people with sterling reputations can be corrupted by power. That knowledge is the first step toward change, because you can't fix a problem you don't understand. And now we understand. We understand that the system needs reform, real reform, not just cosmetic changes. What might that reform look like? Well, For starters, we need much stricter oversight of FISA warrants. The fact that the FBI was able to mislead judges repeatedly without immediate consequences is unacceptable. There should be independent review of FISA applications. There should be severe penalties for anyone who withholds exculpatory evidence. We also need clearer rules about what FBI directors and other top officials can and cannot do. The fact that Comey was able to write secret memos, keep them in his personal safe, and then leak them without facing immediate legal jeopardy shows that the guardrails aren't strong enough. And we need term limits or other mechanisms to ensure that people in these positions don't become too powerful or too entrenched. The FBI director serves a 10-year term specifically to insulate them from political pressure. That's a good idea, in theory, but it also means that if they go rogue, they're very hard to remove. We need to think carefully about how to balance independence with accountability. But beyond policy changes, we need a cultural shift. We need to return to the idea that public service means serving the public, not yourself. It means putting the good of the country above your personal ambitions or your political preferences. It means playing by the rules, even when you're sure you're right and everyone else is wrong. That's a tall order, I know it is. But it's not impossible. We've done it before. There have been moments in American history when things looked bleak, when it seemed like corruption and abuse were just the way things worked, and every time Americans found a way to clean house and start over. Think about the progressive era in the early 1900s, when reformers took on the big political machines and the corrupt officials who ran them. Or think about the post-Watergate reforms in the 1970 seconds, when Congress passed laws to prevent future presidents from abusing their power the way Nixon did. We're at one of those moments again. The Comey saga has exposed rot in institutions that most Americans used to trust without question. But exposure is the first step. What comes next depends on whether we, as citizens, demand change, and whether we hold our leaders accountable when they don't deliver. Now, something that doesn't get mentioned enough in all of this is the human cost. We've talked a lot about institutions and laws and accountability, but behind all of this are real people whose lives were turned upside down. Michael Flynn lost his career, his savings, his reputation, and for years, he faced the threat of prison. Carter Page, the Trump campaign advisor who was surveilled based largely on the Steele dossier, had his life disrupted and his name dragged through the mud, even though he was never charged with anything. And there are people who worked on the Trump campaign or in the Trump administration who found themselves under investigation, their names leaked to the press, their reputations destroyed. Were all of them innocent? No, probably not. Some people did things that deserve scrutiny. But the point is, when you weaponize the justice system, when you use it to pursue political enemies rather than actual criminals, innocent people get caught in the crossfire. And that's not justice. That's revenge. And it's not just the people directly involved, it's all of us. Because every time a story like this breaks, every time we learn that people we trusted were lying or manipulating or abusing their power, it erodes our faith in the system a little bit more. And once that faith is gone, it's very hard to get it back. That's why this matters so much. That's why we can't just shrug and say, well, that's politics and move on. Because if we do, if we accept that this is just how things work now, then we've lost something essential. We've lost the belief that America is different, that we're a nation of laws, not men, that the powerful have to follow the same rules as the rest of us. I don't want to live in a country where that belief is dead. I don't think you do either. So what can we do, practically speaking, right now? Here are a few concrete steps. First, educate yourself. Don't rely on just one news source. Read widely. Seek out different perspectives. Understand the facts, not just the spin. The more informed you are, the harder it is for people to manipulate you. Second, get involved locally. National politics can feel overwhelming and out of reach. But local politics, your city council, your school board, your state legislature, that's where a lot of the decisions that affect your daily life get made. And it's also where your voice can have the most impact. Show up to meetings, ask questions, hold your local officials accountable. Third, support organizations that are fighting for transparency and accountability. There are groups across the political spectrum that are working to reform how our intelligence agencies operate, how surveillance is conducted, how government officials are held accountable. Find ones that align with your values and support them, whether with donations or volunteer time or just by spreading the word. And fourth, vote. I know you've heard that a million times, but it's true. Vote in every election, not just the big presidential ones. Vote for people who take these issues seriously, who understand that the power of government should be used responsibly, who won't tolerate abuse. And when those people let you down, because some of them will vote them out, that's the beauty of democracy. We get to fire our leaders if they don't do the job. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying any of this is easy or that you must do something. Everything you do is your own choice, and real change is hard. It takes time. It takes persistence, and it takes people who are willing to stay engaged even when it feels like nothing is happening. But the alternative, just accepting that this is how things are, that powerful people will always get away with abusing their power, that's not acceptable. At least it's not acceptable to me. And I don't think it's acceptable to you either. So here's my challenge to you. Don't just watch this video and forget about it. Don't just shake your head and think, that's terrible, and then move on with your day. Take one action, just one, to make things better. Because the only way we fix this mess is if all of us, working together, refuse to accept it. The only way we restore trust in our institutions is if we demand that they earn that trust. And the only way we ensure that people like James Comey can't abuse their power in the future is if we hold them accountable today. James Comey thought he could outsmart the system. He thought he could take down a president while protecting his own reputation. But what he really did was expose something bigger, the deep cracks in America's institutions. And here's the truth. Those cracks can only be fixed if we, the people, demand accountability. If you've stayed with me this far, let me know what you think. Was Comey a whistleblower trying to protect democracy, or a man who abused his office to settle political